Hey there, in this one we're going to be using Python to scrape StackOverflow.com. Now the goal here is to scrape questions about technology that we care about and then challenge ourselves to answer those questions. Now, one of the things that you'll come across while you're learning any new programming language is, of course, the documentation. Right? So Python's documentation is amazing. But I would argue it's a lot like handing you an English dictionary while trying to teach you English and assuming that you're going to learn all of English from that dictionary. You certainly can, but it's a lot harder to do it when in context. Now, with programming, as well as like learning a language, you will have questions about things that just don't gel well in your mind. Like they just don't make sense really. And that's where Stack Overflow comes in. And see, I would argue that most developers are always learning, right? So no matter how advanced you are, you're going to be learning a new programming language or some sort of new facet of the ones that you already know. And Stack Overflow is a great place to go to find answers for that. Quora is also a great place for that too, but Stack Overflow overall is going to be the one that's a lot more technical. It's usually just for developers, although I'm sure they have a bunch of other questions elsewhere as well. But Stack Overflow, when you do Google searches for questions like, how does the main function work? Or something like that, you'll likely see Stack Overflow as one of the top results over and over and over again for any given programming language, not just Python. So this is actually twofold of a project that we want to do today, and that is going into the tags, finding a tag that we're interested in. In our case, we're going to be using Python, but what we'll do here is going to work for all of these. And then when you go to one of those tags, you'll see all sorts of questions, right? So these questions are going to be filtered and organized in a way that might be what you want, but they also might not be. So we'll also have to kind of reverse engineer how this actually works so we can actually accurately scrape all of this data. Now, the other benefit of this is if you end up getting into machine learning, actually grabbing a lot of these questions will be really interesting when you get to that point as well. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to open up VS Code, and I'm continuing on from 30 Days of Python. So I'm going to go ahead and make a folder specifically for day 22. And inside of my terminal, inside of VS Code, I'm going to change into that folder of day 22. And we're going to go ahead and do pip env install. And I'm going to be using Jupyter Notebooks, Python requests, request.html. And then we're going to be using the Python version of 3.8. Now, everything we're going to be doing here pretty much will work with Python 3.6 and up, because it's really pretty simple. I mean, we've done scraping before, so the scraping part is probably not that challenging for you. Hopefully not that challenging at this point. But if you've never done scraping, then yeah, this will be pretty interesting. So let's go ahead and go into Stack Overflow and just take a look for a moment while the pip env is installing. So the first thing is I want to actually go into any given tag to start to like engineer how the URLs are working or reverse engineer it. So if we go to stackoverflow.com/tags, we see this. And of course, if I click on JavaScript, I see questions/tagged and JavaScript. And then if I go to Java, same thing, questions, tags, Java. So I already see a pattern here, right? So the root is actually this right here, just stackoverflow.com/questions/tagged, and then whatever comes after that, right? So if I did like, let's try machine-learning, see if that's one, and it is. There's 41,000 questions, so there's a good chance that that's the one for machine learning. And maybe let's try deep learning, some more advanced topics that definitely would be interesting to learn about. But yeah, so we've now see that there's some sort of pattern here, right? And if I type out Django, that's a web application framework for Python, we're getting a lot of intuitive ways to actually grab the topics that we care about. Now, of course, inside of any given question, there's going to be tags or other topics that are tagged to any given question, right? So that sort of makes sense because there's drilling down a little bit further from any given programming language or any given main topic. It's going to have a lot of different tags. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and go back into our project and actually start it. I'll go pip env shell And then we're going to go ahead and do Jupyter Notebook. Of course, Jupyter Notebook is meant to just have an interactive way to write all of these things, especially when you're doing web scraping. This is going to be your best friend, is using Jupyter Notebooks for this. So let's go ahead and create a new notebook, and we'll just call this StackOverflow.com. And let's go ahead and do a few imports here. The first one is requests, and then from requests_HTML, we're going to import HTML. Okay. And in case we didn't actually run the installs we needed, I'm going to use this command here. So the hashtag there to comment it out, and then an exclamation mark, pip install, and this is requests-html and requests. This, of course, will actually run that installation inside of that Jupyter Notebook. Okay, so I'm going to run this cell with Shift-Enter, and I'm going to go ahead and put my base URL here for my tags, right? So this was that URL for every single tagged item that we had. So our actual scraping URL is going to be the tag that we want. So I'm going to go ahead and use, let's call this tag, Python, and then finally URL equals to, we use some f-string substitution here, and then I'll put just like that. Right, so we should see that URL being the actual URL that we need, and there it is. Okay, cool. So that works fine. That's exactly how we wanted it. Now, of course, I can actually open that up with Python requests. So request.get and URL, and then we can just do r.text. And of course, we see an HTML document here. So to actually parse through this HTML document, that's what we're using request HTML for. You could skip a step and actually just use request HTML. That's okay too. But I like actually separating those two things out so I know exactly where the HTML document's going and also exactly where the request is coming from. That's just a pattern I have. Might be the best, might not. Okay, so now that we've got the ability to actually get the HTML content, let's actually go back into that page and kind of think about what it is that we want to do here. Now, Stack Overflow is an amazing place to get questions answered, but you don't want to ask questions that have already been asked. So as a beginner, what you're going to want to do is actually go through the most popular questions and see if you can answer those things. And if you can't answer them, then you dive a little bit deeper. So for us to do this and to actually scrape these questions, I'm going to go ahead and come in to the any given tag, and then in this more side, go ahead and select votes. And what happens is our URL gets tagged or adds a query parameter to it called tab. And this parameter, we can actually see that it is set to votes, right? So if we change that to frequent, that tab will change. Change it to active, that also changes. So that's going to allow you to pick and choose which kind of questions you actually want to go about seeing. Perhaps you want to see all the newest ones. Maybe you want to build your reputation on Stack Overflow, which is maybe a good thing to do if you're looking for a job. You go on Stack Overflow and you answer a bunch of questions and you build your reputation. Going to newest might be a good thing for that. But even before you get there, you're going to want to go to votes and see if you can answer these questions, right? So the top voted items, can you answer these questions? This, I think, is a really good challenge for any programmer that believes they're really good at programming in any given particular language. I'll tell you, some of these will absolutely stump me that I'll have to do research on, and therefore I will learn more skills this way. Now, it might take pages to actually do that, but either way, the point of this is to see what the most popular questions are so we can start to learn Python that much more. Now, to me, I do this out of interest to just gather more knowledge. I don't do it as a simple thing of like, oh, I'm going to learn Python from answering these questions. No, I think you learn Python or any programming language by actually building something real, by doing practical things with it, which is what we're about to do. And then as an added bonus, you'll get all these other questions that you can try and answer. Okay, so when we click on any of these, right, our query parameter up here is going to be changing. So taking note of that, that means that with these votes, that's actually the query parameter we want to use. So I just need to append that at the end of this URL, right? So let's go ahead and grab this and come back into Stack Overflow, and I'm just going to add how I want it sorted. Okay, so the sorting part is going to be votes. If we put a minus in front of it, will that reverse it? In some cases it might. Some websites it might actually reverse it. Not on Stack Overflow. It's not actually going to do that. You would actually have to go to the very, very last page to have it being in reverse. So you could actually start at this page and then work backwards to what we're about to do. I just wanted to mention that in case you were wanting to go to the lowest voted ones. I'm not sure exactly why. But anyways, so here we go. We've got a tag, and then let's go ahead and just go the tab, or rather the query filter. Let's just call it that. And it's going to be votes. And now we have our new URL to actually scrape. Okay, so how do we scrape this URL, or what is it that we're looking for? Now I want to find at least two elements. That is the number of votes and the actual question. So it's really simple. Let's go ahead and inspect the element here with Control click or right click if you're on a Windows. We'll go ahead and inspect in here. And what we see is a question class of question hyperlink. So this is the first one I'm going to go off of. Okay, so let's go ahead, and now that we've got this text, so I'll call this the HTML string. Run that again. Oops, let's set that equal to that. Okay, and then I'll go ahead and say HTML equals to the HTML class, and the HTML is equal to the HTML string. Okay. So this is just putting it into request HTML so we can actually parse through this. And now if I do the actual question, let's say question classes equals to HTML.find, and that was dot question hyperlink. Okay, so this of course is related to request HTML. It's a bit different in Selenium. I'm not going to cover that right now, but the idea here is that we want to look for all of the elements that have this class of question hyperlink. Now, if you're not familiar with HTML, that's going to be a little, uncomfortable probably on how you're actually going to find all of these things. But just in general, you're going to look for the unique instances of stuff. And when we actually scroll over inside of Chrome specifically, we can see which element is selected. So this is a little bit of an art and a science because not everyone defines these things the exact same way. Now the other one, the more general one, is just question summary. So perhaps we want that block. And if we see here, scrolling through, question summary looks to be the actual parent element of each individual question block. So perhaps we want the summary first, like that's going to be the top level thing instead of just the hyperlink. So let's go ahead and go to the summary, and I'll call this question summaries, and then we will print what this is out. So I'll go ahead and print out question summaries, and there we go. So I've gotten each individual element. As you see here, we've got a element of a div. The class is question summary, and then we've got an ID here. So going back into the look of the HTML, the actual content itself, that it's given us that exact same content back. And I have a sneaking suspicion that question-summary with that ID might actually be the real ID for that question on Stack Overflow, which we'll test that out in a little bit. But for now, I can also do something inside of each question summary. So I'm just going to grab one of them because we got a list of them right there. And I'm going to do .text. So this is actually all of the text that's inside of that div tag, right? And if I print it out, it will actually give me a better Python formatted item here. So it's giving me the number of votes, the number of answers, the number of views, and so on, right? So these might be actually accurate columns, right? So in other words, if I put this into a column, like let's say for instance, my columns are votes, vote, title, answer, or maybe number of answers, and views. I'm quite literally going line by line, guessing what it is that each one of these things are, right? There's no rhyme or reason to this. I'm just guessing, okay? So this right here, this is, let's call this let's say short description, and then this right here, I'm just guessing again, looks like tags. So tags, and then date, and then user, and then maybe user detail or user details. Okay, so those are my guessed columns. Now I'm calling them columns because I want to think of this in terms of like a database or a spreadsheet. So if I were to turn each question into a database, which is something we'll do, I want to actually start putting them in columns, and then each row would actually be the values of those things. So I'm sort of treating this as like one row. So what I want to do now is actually turn that into a list. So I'll go ahead and say this row equals to the list of that first question summary text. Okay, and I'll go ahead and print this out. Didn't work like I wanted, right? So why not? Well, remember the print statement often gives me, it, reformats the /in. /in will give you a new line. So to actually turn that into a list, we can do .text split of that new line. Okay. So now when I do this row, I'm actually getting that same content into a row. And let's go ahead and see if the length of this row is equal to the length of the columns. The answer is yes. Now again, I did all of this stuff guessing, right? I have never actually done it this way. It's all fresh. And the reason I'm doing this is because there is some intuition you'll start to gather while you do more and more projects, especially with web scraping. We're not going to actually end up doing it this way. I want to be more explicit about the things that I want to grab, but it's nice to see how this stuff works. Okay, so what I can actually do is turn this into a dictionary of values as well, because I have the column names, or at least this is what I'm calling them. What I can do is actually turn this into a row data, and you can do dict of zip, and this is going to be the keys will be columns, and then the values will be this row. And then I'll go ahead and print out the row data. Okay, now I'm guessing a lot of you have never ever seen something like this before. Now the first thing is zip. What zip does is it takes two lists and think of like a zipper, it zips them together. And then if you put dict around there, it actually turns them into a dictionary based off of the first values with the second values. Sure, it might be complicated, might seem complicated, but another way to use this is saying for row, or let's say columns, or column and row value, for columns and row value. In zipping that, we will see that print column and row v is going to be the corresponding like location or position for that data. Okay, so let's print it out. And so as you see here, votes is in position 0, and you get that number. Again, votes is in position 0, and we got that number. Right, so that's what's happening with zip. They're just going right next to each other. Now what happens if I actually change my number of columns and try and do it again? They're no longer true. I zip these things together and run it through. You just don't get that data, right? It's just not actually giving you the correct data that you had prior, right? So num answers view. There you go. That's incorrect. Now the question, I spelled that incorrectly, but so it's not actually zipping the right amount of things. It's just leaving out some values, and it appears to be leaving out this value right here, the very last value. So it's important that we actually have the correct number of columns with the actual values that we want to associate it to, but it's not required. It's not going to give you an error. It's instead going to give you potentially very bad data, which is why we're not going to go this way. That's part of the reason why is like there's a lot of things that can go wrong with turning a split statement into something, and I just sort of illustrated it. But the thing that can go wrong is if we go into the question itself, like what if they actually added one more piece in here, like one more column, if you will, that sort of might change how all of that data comes out. Not sort of, it will change how all that data comes out. And then mapping, when I say mapping, I mean my actual key value pairs, right? So all of this will break, okay? So again, if I added another column in here and I said ABC and then ran this again, everything's wrong again, right? So we want to avoid those sorts of things, but it is nice to know that it is possible. Okay, so I'm still going to keep those columns though. I do think those are good and useful columns, but for now I'm going to go ahead and just comment this data out. Okay, and I'm leaving it in there just for reference if you want to review it another time. Okay, so now what I want to do is actually go through the summaries now, each summary, and find the elements that are most interesting to me. Perhaps I want all of these columns. In my case, I do not. All I really want is the number of votes in the actual question itself. You know, perhaps you want more context with a short description. Perhaps you want other tags. I'll leave that up to you. So let's go ahead and go back into the HTML itself, and let's inspect the element for the question. We already sort of started this way, but we got question hyperlink here. So I'm going to go ahead and say that's one of them that I definitely want. So let's go ahead and say the classes needed. It's going to be question hyperlink. Okay. And then coming back, votes. So let's go ahead and inspect that element. And votes, the actual direct element itself doesn't have a class, but the closest parent element does. And then even the parent element above that has one as well. I think I actually want this one because I don't need the text of votes in there. But to make things simple, I'm actually going to use the class of just vote because there's only a little bit of data in there. Right, so there's the number and the text of votes. But again, I want to make things simple on me, so I'm just going to use that class of vote. Okay. And there we go. So dot vote. So now we want to go into the question summaries again. I'm going to just go ahead and use my first example. So this question element equals to the very first one. Okay. And I want to go through and look for those actual elements in it. So I'll go ahead and do this question element dot find and the question, dash hyperlink, not hyper, but hyperlink, and then dot text. Okay, so list element. Yes, of course. So find gives me a list of things. That is a very common thing here. So I need to pass in first being true. We hit enter. There we go. So first being the actual first element that it finds of that actual class. That is, again, a feature of requests HTML. So that gives me the actual question. Well, that's cool. Now, let's do that same thing. And this time for votes. Enter. And there I've got the number of votes. It is including votes itself. So naturally what I can do is just replace /in and votes with an empty string. Run shift enter. And there, now I've got my number of votes. Now, similar problem that I mentioned before, but I don't think that one small element like this is going to have drastic changes. Now, we could do even more analysis on this and use something called regular expressions to actually pull out just the numbers. But in this case, this works just fine. So now let's actually pull out this data for this page, right? So the entire question summaries list. I want to get all of that data. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and say data's equals to an empty list. And then I'll do for QL, as in question element, in question summaries. I'm going to want to find these same classes, right? So we can do another for loop for these classes to find that data, right? So both of them are first. So it's simple. We'll do for, sub L in classes needed. Then I'll do the question element itself dot find the sub element, or rather, this actually probably shouldn't be sub element. The sub element itself should be sub L, and this should just be, you know, underscore class. We don't want to use class itself because that's a Python, a built-in Python method itself. So we use underscore class find, and then first being true, and then I can print out my sub L dot text and enter, and that gives me the questions, the votes, and all that stuff, right? So it's also giving me this string of votes. Okay. So how do I actually put this now into the datas, right? So what I want to do is turn this value here into a dictionary itself. So we can do this by saying enumerate classes needed. So I'll do I, comma. So this gives me the actual index value for enumerate, right? So index 0, index 1. So then the actual key names, so we'll say key names equals to question, or not question, but question and votes. Okay. So that means then that I can actually set that value in here, and we'll say I'm going to give the question data an empty dictionary here, and then we will say question data and some sort of key here. Now we just set some key names, so that key name is going to be related. These indices are related: index 0, index 0, index 1, index 1. Not a huge surprise here that we will now say the key name equals to key names of I. Right, again, enumerate is giving me the index value, and then I can say key name equals to the sub element text. I'm no longer going to print it, and then after it loops through the classes needed, I'm going to append question data to datas. So datas.append. And then after that's all said and done, let's just print the very first element inside of datas. Hit enter. I got key names is not defined. Make sure we run this cell after I named it. Okay, there we go. So we've got question and data. It's actually giving us the values that we're looking for, and it's doing it in a much more explicit manner. And so I could also use some cleaning, some replacement data, right? So this text right here, maybe I want to pull out some data in it. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new function, and we'll say clean, scraped data, and we'll just give the argument here of text. And then in this case, I'm actually just going to return text.replace and number of votes with, something empty. Okay. So I'm just going to call that right on here. Let's run that again. And there we go. So now I've got my question and the number of votes. Of course, if I look at all of the datas, I got a bunch of them. Questions and votes. Pretty cool if you ask me. Now this is a lot more explicit than when we had before. And of course, this part right here, perhaps we want to pass the key name in here as well. So key name equaling to none. And then at some point, maybe if we say if key name equals to votes, then we do that. Otherwise, we just return the text itself. And then that way, we're not actually having other issues with the cleaning, right? So if the question has, for some reason, number of votes in there, we probably don't want to pull that out. We just want to pull it out in votes. And therefore, that's a little bit better of a parsing for this particular item. Let's go ahead and add another piece that I might actually want to add to my data, right? So let's add in tags, right? So I want to actually add in a class for the tags. I don't actually know what the class is yet, so let's go back into the element, and I'm going to go to where the tags are and just inspect here. In this case, I'm just going to get the very parent one. In this case, also, it worked out that the class of tags was the correct class. I just guessed that, and there it is. Right, so I'm not going to add anything else to it. It does have individual classes for each tag itself, but as I've seen, my actual function here, right, is going to get the text. So we want to actually grab that. So this text right here, sub-element text, and it's going to clean it up and do all that. So I've got my tags here. But now what I want to do is actually convert the new lines into, I think I want to convert them into commas. So let's go ahead and see that. I'm just literally guessing here, right? So I haven't actually seen this yet. So I want to change the new line into a comma. So let's go ahead and try this out and take a look at my first data's element. And there we go. So it didn't change it into commas, but it is still in the format that I might be able to use later, right? So I could change this in the future. I'm not going to change it now, so I can totally just remove this whole thing and come through, and there we go. Okay, so that's actually scraping one page, though. Now that we can add additional classes and we know how to map them to keys, of course, there's still a problem as what if the actual question itself, what if those classes changed? Well, it would certainly break this whole thing. So that's one of the challenges that we face when we do web scraping, is things breaking. But the vast majority of websites don't change that often, especially not their classes, because a number of elements rely on it, including CSS and JavaScript, which changing these class names often breaks their entire site. So the only thing you really need to look for is massive, massive changes. But of course, when you run this, you would see that very, very, very quickly. Okay, so now that we've got that down, let's go ahead and actually go through multiple pages now. Okay, so it goes right back up to this request here. So what I want to do is actually say parse, tagged page. So I want to extract the same data from a specific tag page. Right, so I want to grab these data's item here, and I'm going to pass them through here. Okay, and then let's scroll up a little bit to the actual key names and the classes needed. I will add these in here as well. And I also need to grab where the question summaries came from. All right, so that's from the actual HTML itself. So I'll go ahead and grab this and bring that into the function too. So we will pass in the actual page HTML, and that's actually what we're going to do, is parse the HTML itself and then return back the datas. Right, so, or the list of the data elements that we were looking for. Okay, cool. So let's try this again, and this time I'm going to just use a different page altogether. So I'm going to put these all as one as well, and come down here. And let's hit enter, and we'll do define, and this is going to be extract data from URL. So we'll pass in the URL. Here's the URL data. Okay. And we will also say if, I want to just basically say if our status code not in range 200 or 299, then we'll just return back an empty list. All right. So we got to just assume that this is a valid request. Okay, so then we've got the URL there. Once we have the HTML, I'll go ahead and say datas equals to parse tagged page of that HTML, and then we'll return those datas. So that's from a specific URL now, instead of how we had it before. So let's go ahead and run these. So now let's just go ahead and use a different URL. So I'm going to copy this down here, and you bet we will turn this into a function too. But instead of Python, I'll just go ahead and say JavaScript. And we'll extract that data. And we'll see what that looks like. And we get, age. Oops, that's should be page. Copying and pasting functions is usually better than that. Okay, so there we go. So now I have roughly the exact same thing specifically for a new tag now. Okay, so there's one thing that I'm missing though. And what I want to call this is just say define scrape tag. Okay, so I don't need the base URL in an argument. I can just leave that in here. I do want the tag itself. I can also add in the query filter itself. And then I also want to say what page it's going to be. So we'll just start out with page 1. And maybe we'll want a number of pages that we'll do. So we'll say max pages equals to, let's say, 50. So literally 50 pages that it'll scrape. I'm going to tab this in a little bit. So now I just need to loop through each one of those pages. So we'll say for p in range max pages. Okay. So I could start at a specific page, or I could just go off of max pages, and I'll just go off of max pages. Okay, so I'll comment these out, and we'll just print out page itself. And then I'm going to run this scrape tag part right here. So scrape tag, let's just run that. And a little spelling error there. Okay, so pages, it goes up to 49. So it's 0 to 49. So the actual page number that we're going to use is going to be equal to p plus 1. Right, so page 1, 2, and so on, all the way up to 50. And so now we actually need to know how that part of the URL works. So let's come in here and just scroll down to where it's in pagination. So I hit page 2. There you go. You got page 2 there. It's giving me a page size. So I can go to page 1. This is the same page that we were just looking at, as well as page size. If I change that size to like 50, it may or may not give me 50 items. It looks like it does. Okay, so those are the new parameters that we just need to add in down here. Okay, so let's go ahead and copy this here. And we've got our tab already. And here's those new parameters. Okay, so page size, that could be another one that I pass in. In this case, I'll just say 25. The smaller page size, naturally, it's going to go a lot faster. Okay, and then the actual page number is this page number, so in the iteration or the loop itself. Okay, so the tag is the one that's being passed into that scrape tag, and then it's going to extract this data. So I actually don't need these right here because they're coming through in the argument for the function itself. And then my new data is equal to that. So I actually want to have one more list here, and I'll say datas is plus equals to that, and then we'll return those datas. Datas is probably not the best thing to call it, but let's leave that. And my default I want to leave as Python. Okay, so now when I scrape this, it's going to go through all 50 pages, and it's going to go, well, maybe not super fast, but pretty fast. One of the bad things about doing it this way is actually how fast it's going to go. That I might get a block thing from Stack Overflow. They might actually prevent me from going forward. Now, of course, I didn't actually test these page number and page size. One would assume that you would do that before actually creating this function, but we already went through a number of things here that I'm fairly confident this is going to end up working out. And then there we go. So we actually have all of this data, right? So that I just scraped all of Stack Overflow for 50 pages and 25 results per page. Now, not every programming language is going to have that, or every tag is not going to have that many items in there. So that's cool. So that's the actual scraping portion of this. Now, of course, I want to actually store this somewhere, and I want to store it into a data frame using something called pandas. So I actually want to store it to a CSV file, okay? And I'm going to use my tag of Python again. I'm just going to run that one more time. And while that runs, the next thing I want to actually install is actual pandas. So Python Pandas is a really, really great library, but we're just going to use it to store this data into a CSV file. Oops, I want to make sure that this is ran after the scraping event, and then I'll comment it out. So I actually ran it. Scraping event's still going. We're going to let that finish. While that's still working, I will add in one more aspect to this, and we're going to import time. Okay, so it's installing pandas and all the pandas dependencies. So I want to actually import time, and on each iteration of the scraping, I actually want to add some time in here. So I'll do time.sleep, and it's going to be, I don't know, 1.2 seconds. Now again, you don't want to do superhuman level performance when you do web scraping, because that's the surefire way to get blocked from doing web scraping in general. Also, being a good citizen of the internet, we don't want to just hammer people's websites, right? Even if it's a huge company, you don't want to hammer their websites. Huge companies are much more likely to block you anyway. So I just wanted to add that little thing in each web scraping iteration. But now we have this data. So if I print out the length of it, no surprise here, I get 2500. So now that we've got that, let's go ahead and import pandas as well. So we'll do import pandas as PD. And then we'll go ahead and turn the datas into a data frame. So this is just essentially a spreadsheet, but a very fast and robust one that we can use with Python. So pandas, oops, this should be datas, and I need to make sure that import is coming through. Shift enter up here. There we go. So we've got pandas in there now, and if I run it now, I've got my data frame, and I can do df.shape, and this will give me two values here. One is the number of rows, and the other one's the number of columns. So we've got question, votes, and tags. Of course, the tags are not comma separated, but they are space separated, right? So each tag has a space in between them, and the actual tag elements themselves might have a dash in there as well. And so we actually don't want the tags to be comma separated right now, because I want to save this as a CSV file. If I save this as a CSV file and there's comma separated columns, you're going to have really messed up columns, right? So you actually don't want commas inside of a CSV file other than the ones that separate the columns. So we'll just do df.toCSV, and in this case I'm just going to call it python.csv, and I'll also say index equals to false. So index is this column right here. If you actually want to save that column, you can, but index to false won't save that column, but it will save the headers, so question, votes, and tags. So we'll go ahead and run that. And we'll look into this folder here inside of VS Code. And sure enough, there we go. There's all of that data. So now you can just get a random question and go, okay, what's the difference between lists and tuples? What is that question, right? So how do you actually answer that yourself? This is what I want you to do, is just take random questions and start to answer them. Here's another one. How to return a dictionary keys as a list in Python. That is super easy, but very useful, right? So yeah, now we have the data, we have it stored, and we have a way to scrape in the future. So I think that's pretty cool. Now, there's a lot more stuff that we could do to this to make it more robust, right? So one of those things is actually getting the ID for the question. I'm not going to do this, but I will actually give you a hint on how to do it. So if you click on any given question, what you'll see in the URL is the actual ID up here. Now, I'm not positive if it's the ID, but I'm like 95% sure that that's their database ID. And if I get rid of that last portion, in other words, if I just pass in the ID, I actually get the individual question itself. It does append stuff to it. But if I go to any question, so if I go back a couple, you're going to see those unique numbers. So there's a couple of ways on how we could go about doing this. Number one, I can inspect the element, and I can look at the URL itself and use a regular expression to parse those numbers. We actually did this in a previous day for scraping Amazon, you could actually scrape that URL itself and parse out what that URL is. Another way to do it would be to grab the ID attribute to the question summary itself and then parse out that question. So those are two quick ways on how you can actually grab that ID. Another thing is, instead of grabbing the ID, perhaps you just grab the URL for the question hyperlink. That might be another way to actually get direct content into the data, right? And the reason you do that is to actually get the answer. What is the actual answer that I want from this? Now, I don't want to scrape too much of these things because that was not the goal here. The goal, again, was to get the question and then the tags. Now, another cool thing that you could do in the future, after you learn some machine learning, is to add and create a question, or let's say an auto tagging question, bot. So you would actually type in some sort of question and then it would automatically apply tags to it. This is actually well prepared for that. There's still some more things that you would probably want to do, but overall, this is ready to actually handle something like that, where the tags are the labels and the question is a feature of the actual machine learning. So that's it. Thanks so much for watching day 22. Let me know if you have any questions on this. And of course, all of this code is on our GitHub. Just check the description for that. And we'll see you next time.